Hello, everyone. I'm Roberto Motta, and today I welcome Mr. Douglas Murray. Mr. Murray is a writer and a journalist based in Britain and the author of The War on the West. Mr. Murray, welcome to our program.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
First, I want to congratulate you on your book. It is exceptionally well written. Your writing is clear. The book is very well documented, and the Brazilian translation is very good. It's
I'm pleased to hear that.
Yeah, it's a book that I often recommend to my viewers.
I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you.
So to get things going, I would like to quote from the introduction to your book. Okay. You say, in recent years, it has become clear that there is a war going on, a war on the West. This is not like earlier wars where armies clash and victors are declared. It is a cultural war, and it's been waged remorselessly against all the roots of the Western tradition and against everything good that the Western tradition has produced. And in this text, you make several key points. First, a lot of us sense that there is something wrong in politics, in schools, in journalism. And it's also clear to many of us that language is being manipulated before our very eyes. However, a lot of people are led to believe that those weird changes that we see are being made for our own good, that they would make our societies more just and more inclusive. So what's the truth behind this? Is this really an attack? And if it's an attack, who's behind it?
It's a very important question, and it's very important to get it in the right context. I wrote about this a bit in my previous book as well, The Madness of Crowds. But as I see it, let's steel man rather than straw man the argument of, let's say, my opponents or the people I'm criticizing in this book and others. They claim that what they're after is a more equal and a more just society. Now, I actually think that none of that is at all able to be disagreed with. I think almost everybody from across the political spectrum would say, okay, of course, we all want a more equal and just society. People diverge on the question of what is it that you're really after that? So, for instance, if you say you want equality in society, do you mean equality before the law? Or do you mean, for instance, equity, which is what much of the modern left actually wants and says it wants, which is that everybody's outcome in life should be the same, irrespective of achievement, ability, effort, and much more. Likewise, there are rights movements, again, I wrote about this in The Madness of Crowds, which say they want equality and freedom and actually want a form of superiority, to be treated rather better than other people. Now, the way I see it and the way I try to explain the war on the West is that this includes now an attempt by people to say that they are trying to equalize the historical terrain, to say, for instance, we haven't had enough criticism of ourselves historically. We've thought ourselves better than other people, and therefore it's time to equal the playing field. And here's where I think that we are. I think societally in the West, as in some of the modern rights movements, the train was just about to pull into the station, then went roaring off into the distance and veered off the tracks. So I'm all for a suitable estimation of our historic past in the West. Most people, I think, are. What I am not for, and what part of the modern left in particular is for some kind of historical accounting to occur that takes, in my view, in my analysis, a very, very uncharitable, to say the least, analysis of the West's history and a wildly charitable view of the history of everyone else. So that, for instance, everything at the moment in Western democracies is looked at through the lens of what is described repeatedly, particularly in America, where I am at the moment, as the original founding sins: the sin of slavery, in Europe, the sin of colonialism, the sin of racism. And these three founding sins are being seen as not just a part of the history of the West, which they undoubtedly are, but as the history of the West. And these things are wrenched out of their context and are now used effectively to bash the West over the head with repeatedly, including all the citizens of the West, to say that people in America who have no involvement with slavery should feel some kind of deep angst about it, and indeed pay up for something that they had no benefit from and no involvement in. These are all manifestations of the problem. This deep animus, which is fueling so much of the modern left in particular, it's not just the left, it's mainly on the left. They are being fueled by an animus against the origins of the societies that they live in. And it's extraordinarily destructive. And I think it is highly unlikely, to say the least, that the game that they are engaged in is likely to get them to the outcomes they profess to desire. I.e., even if you do this for decades, it is not remotely clear that you get more peace, more justice, more equality in your society. In fact, I think quite the opposite. I think you put a powder keg underneath the society that was getting on pretty well.
You also make the point in your book that the West is not only failing to react to this attack, but even some of the Western leaders are joining in the attack,
Yes.
self-bashing. Why is that? Is there a common feeling of guilt? Why are we failing to react, to recognize and react to this attack?
I think one reason is that it plays on people's good side. For instance, as I said before, no sensible person would say there's nothing we've ever done in our historical past of which we should be in any way ashamed. Almost nobody reasonable could say that. Everybody knows that history was bloody for everyone, and some things went better than others. But if you're a certain type of politician in particular, you see a little bit of historical ground here, which you can apologize for and gain some points for in the present. Let me give you an example. In Canada, we've had a number of political leaders now, but including the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who is very, very fond of apologizing for the Canadian past. Very fond of apologizing for things that happened centuries before even little Justin was born. By contrast, he finds it not just difficult, but impossible to apologize for anything he has done himself, which has been proven to be bad. So, for instance, he will never apologize for the way in which he treated protesters in Ottawa last year. He will never apologize for that. He smirks his way through any question about it. He grotesquely abused the human rights of thousands of Canadians. But he will never apologize for that. By contrast, he is first in line to apologize for things over which he had no involvement. Now, in my view, this is, in his case, an almost entirely cynical political exercise. It's to make himself look virtuous, to make himself look good, to make himself look kind, and much more. Let me give you another example. If in the British context, a British politician was to say, and thank goodness we haven't had very much of this among British leaders, we have had some of it, but not as much as in Canada. If a British leader were to stand up and make, I don't know, an apology for some aspect of colonialism, that politician would have had nothing to do with colonialism. So what are they trying to do? And the answer is almost entirely it is to burnish some credential for themselves. My view, and I say this in The War in the West, is that when we get to historical apology or historical restitution, we're in very dodgy terrain, because the person who is apologizing has not done any wrong. And the person being apologized to is not a person themselves who was wronged. There was just this week a story, it rather amused me, of a BBC journalist who's got herself a huge amount of publicity, not coincidentally, I think, in her own eyes, by discovering that some of her ancestors were involved in the slave trade in Grenada. And she has made repeated trips and is making another one, I think accompanied by a lot of press again. That's not in the old days, if you wanted to make an act of charity or restitution, you did it privately. That used to be the deal. Now you do it in the full glare of cameras so that everyone can see. And this BBC journalist has found out that her family were involved in the slave trade. She's making repeated trips to Grenada to apologize to who? Nobody there has been involved in the slave trade. In fact, many of the people on the island will be the descendants of people who were themselves slavers. But what is really going on here? This is an existential question for the journalist that I mentioned. But it does no actual good because, as I say, the person who is apologizing has done no wrong, and the person accepting the apology and sometimes accepting or demanding the money is not somebody themselves who has suffered. And besides, as I say at another point in the book, when you get to this whole issue of historical reparations, who is to say? You know, I'm not by any means diminishing the crime of slavery, but you know, did a working class man in the north of England in the 19th century have very much freedom more than a slave if he worked in a mill and his average life expectancy was about 36 or 38? Not much, no, there wasn't all that much. I mean, you can't really say that person was very free. He was freer than a slave, yes. But would the descendants of such a person have a right to demand some kind of historical restitution? Down the line from where we're going, yes. Yes, they would. So we're in a very dangerous game where the West is being portrayed as the sole victimizer, and the rest of the world is being portrayed as meek victims of Western aggression.
In your book, and I quote, you say, only the Western countries spread across 3 continents were told constantly that in order to have any legitimacy at all, to be even considered decent, they should swiftly and fundamentally alter their demographic makeup. Yes. The vision of the 21st century appeared to be that China would be allowed to remain China. The various countries of the Far and Middle East and Africa should be allowed, indeed expected, to remain as they were, or even return to something they may have once been. And the question is, who makes this call? Where did the idea come from that the West must open, diversify, maybe cease to be Western, while China and Eastern countries remain what they are, and even stronger?
Well, again, interestingly enough, it starts it can start in a good place. It doesn't always, but it can start in a good place. There is something to be said for a certain amount of diversity in a society, I believe. For instance, a diversity of opinion. And a diversity of opinion can often come from a diversity of experiences. And you might say, well, if we have, you know, the best people from India, the best people from China, and so on in our societies, we all benefit. I think that's a perfectly plausible argument to be made there. What I don't believe is that benefit is endless. That is, after the first 1,000 migrants, you have a certain benefit if you did it correctly. If you have the next million, it's not clear that you get many thousands of times the benefit. If you then go millions more, it's not obvious that you get millions of times the benefit. You simply have more people from another culture in your country, and some of them will benefit the country, and many will not. So the sort of the diversity idea starts in a relatively good place, but as I say, swiftly goes off the tracks because because of what I just described, that you have this phenomenon that it's just not an endlessly giving attribute. However, Western societies have massively transformed, particularly European societies, in our own lifetimes, and have become, as I say, effectively United Nations melting pots. And one of the consequences of that is that people have to say things like diversity is our strength. Almost all politicians in the West now say this. Almost all church leaders and others say this. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, said this again recently: diversity is our strength. And they've started to have to say it, not least because it has to be the case. Because you've diversified the society so much, you can't say, they think you can't say, actually, diversity isn't endlessly good. That's my view, is that diversity is not endlessly good. It has some good aspects, but it's not endlessly good. For instance, it also brings problems. You import people from certain cultures, certain countries, particularly countries that have been in brutal civil wars like Somalia, and you import a large number of people who have been tested in violence and may well bring that to your streets, as has happened in London and other cities. Scandinavia is another example, Scandinavian cities. So it's not clear that if you import certain people in large numbers that you do get any benefit. But our politicians and others have to keep saying diversity is our strength, diversity is our strength. What they don't realize also is that this is a profoundly anti-Western idea in itself, because it suggests that what we have is not enough. And as I say, there's a little bit in there, which is, yes, you always want to be able to hear different ideas, get different expertise, and so on. But we have, as I say in that quote you referred to there, we have got to this very strange place. China is doing pretty well economically. It's doing hideously in human rights terms. It's doing hideously morally and much more. But it's doing pretty well economically. The only power in the world that has the possibility of overtaking America as the predominant economy in the current century. So it's doing pretty well. Does China have diversity? Absolutely not. In a country like my own country of birth, Great Britain, we have a prime minister whose parents came from India. If my parents had migrated to Canada, or any other British person's parents had migrated to Canada, or indeed if to China, if my parents or any other British person's parents had migrated to China, or Rishi Sunak's parents had migrated not to Britain but to China, what are the chances of getting to the top of Chinese politics? Absolutely zero. Absolutely zero. Nil. They're not interested in diversity in politics or anything else. It's not a game they're playing. And I think this is very, very telling. The predominant narrative of the modern West, diversity is our strength, diversity, 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 somehow is not something we believe that is necessary for anyone else. No one is currently trying to diversify Angola, for instance. Nobody is arguing that Bhutan doesn't have enough diversity and we must throw in quite a lot of Australians, say, to bring it some diversity. The argument is ridiculous if you state it like that, but it is so much ingrained in the modern West that it's sort of heretical even to question it. Of course it's our strength. Of course it's our strength. How dare you question the diversity creed? And as I say, one result of that is that people don't realize that this claim in itself about diversity is itself inherently anti-Western. It suggests that we don't have much unless other people come in from other cultures and give it to us. And I think that is a profoundly misleading and just simply demonstrably untrue story of the Western past and of the Western present.
Another quote from your book, you say, the discourse on race grew even worse. Racial minorities who had integrated well in the West contributed to the West, and were even admiring of the West were increasingly treated as though they were race traitors, as though another allegiance was expected of them. Radicals who wanted to tear everything down were venerated. That's exactly what's happening in Brazil. What are the origins of this, in your opinion? Is it a deliberate political and ideological strategy? Why are we venerating radicals?
Yes, well, I'm afraid it's very disturbing to know that it's happening in Brazil as in so many other places. In America, which is, I think, responsible for much of the export of these bad ideas at the moment to all of our countries. In America, you can see the shift in the half a century from Martin Luther King to George Floyd. People venerated Martin Luther King, and quite rightly, we still do. Not just because he was a man of peace and believed that you should achieve things through peaceful means and through the force of argument, persuasion, rhetoric, and much more. But I mean, that his vision was a vision of a post-racial society where effectively the color of your skin was as unimportant as the color of your hair. Now, that seems to me, at any rate, to be, it has challenges, but it seems to me to be about the only option you can head for in a pluralistic, multiracial society. And yet in half a century, America has completely inverted that vision of Martin Luther King's, of the dream of a world where skin color didn't matter. America today is a country where skin color matters almost more than ever, where people are utterly, utterly obsessed with it. Every employer, every government agency, every time somebody gets any job, certainly any high status job, it's interesting it doesn't work so much with the low status ones, but anyone getting a high status job, politics, the media, endless other things, they will always be being looked at in modern America through the lens of race. In fact, many jobs, apart from that, you need to demonstrate your own history of commitment to equity and diversity. You have to effectively, as in communist times, you have to demonstrate your allegiance to the party line. What have you done to show that you are morally good, morally in lockstep? I think this is a catastrophe for society. I spend most of my time in America these days, and I see this up close, and I think it's a catastrophe. But look at the people who are venerated today. You have the weird sanctification of George Floyd. George Floyd was killed in 2020 by a policeman who's now serving a life sentence in prison in appalling circumstances. There is, as I say in the book, no evidence that he was killed because he was black. We just saw recently in Memphis 5 black police officers kill a black suspect in very similar circumstances, equally, if not more, violent. I mean, to my mind, this demonstrates, among other things, that a lot of these police interactions, if not most, have nothing to do with race. But George Floyd's death was taken in 2020 as not just a symbol of the problem of racism in modern America, but the problem of the West. This demonstrates, this one terrible police interaction was spun by academics from America, by broadcasters and journalists from America, by media personalities, by politicians. It was spun through the cycle of people saying, this interaction shows us. And I fundamentally reject that. I show at some length in The War on the West the way in which it is demonstrably untrue. But we see now the veneration of the victim there, the turning of George Floyd, he should not have been killed, but was not an admirable person. We see the turning of him into a sort of secular saint. Nancy Pelosi, the former Democrat leader of the House, said just last year, she looked up at the skies and she said, "Thank you, George Floyd. Thank you for giving your life for justice." Extraordinary. As if praying to a saint who had sacrificed themselves for their faith. First of all, there's no evidence that George Floyd went out that morning expecting to be a martyr for social justice, and would have been rather surprised that Nancy Pelosi made him so. But we have to ask ourselves, why have we got to this position of venerating unpleasant people who happen to have suffered sometimes, not always, sometimes, and ignored the moral examples that we were holding on to until just a few years ago? People who gave us the idea of societies that were moving beyond race. Why have we ditched that and, in fact, inverted the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King?
You also say in your book, The War on the West is a book about what happens when one side in a Cold War, the side of democracy, reason, rights, and universal principles, prematurely surrenders. Too often we frame this fight all wrong. We allow it to be called temporary or on the fringe, or merely dismiss it as a cultural war. We misinterpret the aims of the participants or downplay the role it will have in the lives of future generations. And my question to you is, if it's not a culture war, what kind of war is it? And what are the aims of the people behind it?
I think it's a war on the foundations of the West. That's the most basic level of it. I think that you can see this by the individuals that have been singled out for particularly terrible treatment. I recently did a series that can be found on YouTube called Uncancelled History, a set of 10 interviews with historians about subjects and individuals who have been treated appallingly in recent years. I mean, whose reputations have been treated appallingly. And one of the many things that I tried to uncover there is something which I write about in The War on the West, which is why the target selection of the statue topplers and the modern day iconoclasts, as I call them, are picked as they are. For instance, there has been for a long time a controversy in America about Christopher Columbus. It's been going back about 30 years or so, 20 years at least. Columbus Day now has to be reframed as a sort of Indigenous Persons Day. And Christopher Columbus gets portrayed, instead of as a man of his time, as everyone is, rather remarkable, very brave man, rather humane and forward-thinking for his day, who certainly achieved an extraordinary and world-changing feat by setting out with the wind behind him and thinking he was going to get to China and discovering America. This is somebody who used to be venerated because he was not just because he discovered, I put it in quotes, America, but because he was brave and an explorer of renown. He's a foundational figure whose statues have now been toppled across America and whose name has been traduced. Look at the founding fathers in America, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and others. All of them have had their statues torn down in recent years. Not all of them, not all of their statues, but a significant number. Have had their names taken off buildings and many more. Well, what does America do without the founding fathers? The New York Times, used to be the paper of record, gave its name to a project to reframe the founding of America to the date 1619, which is the date when the first slaves were brought in. The New York Times said its aim was to change the founding date of America to 1619 so that the whole nation's history could be understood as a story of slavery. In Britain, you see things like the attacks on, most recently, Sir Francis Drake, the great explorer and naval man. You see the attacks on Lord Nelson, the head of the fleet, who won at Trafalgar. You see the attacks on Winston Churchill. These were figures who were the most venerated people in Britain for a range of things, not least their heroism and their role in saving their country. All of these people have been attacked in recent years, all of them. Names taken off buildings, names taken off schools, statues attacked, and much more. So my view has become that actually the people who are waging this war on the West are deliberately going for the most holy places. And I say this in secular terms, but the most holy secular places we have, the things where we store our pride, the people in whom we store our pride and find our unity and our purpose and our drive as a nation. And I'm certain the same thing is happening in Brazil. The attack on the foundational figures who used to unite a nation has become commonplace. And the reason is because the radicals who do it don't just wish to tear down people from the past who they find amazingly don't share our views in the 2020s, but they wish to put their own icons up there in the holy places. And most of all, these people want to put themselves in this place. Because after all, if you go through history, I mean, nobody in history thought everything we think in the 2020s. Inevitably, it's absurd. We don't think things that people will think 800 years from now. But the move to attack every holy place of the West is partly done by people who would like to say, okay, we've torn down the whole landscape, and now I appoint myself the sheriff of the public square. And I'm afraid that is one of the many things that's going on at the moment in all of our countries.
And speaking of the consequences of this, again, a quote from your book, you say, a new generation does not appear to understand even the most basic principles of free thought and free expression. And that's a reality we find in Brazil every day, several times a day. Yeah. Will this rejection of everything Western eventually affect our ability to use, for instance, the scientific method? And will this mean that the Eastern countries, which are not affected by this, will then get supremacy over the West, uncontested supremacy?
I think it's inevitable if we keep going down this route, yes. Think of the amount of time taken up on any university campus by the consideration of issues that are of peripheral significance. I give extraordinary, bizarre examples in the War on the West of professions that should have nothing to do with this social justice movement that calls itself social justice and actually is just a radical leftist movement. I give examples of people like nuclear scientists, nuclear physicists, who are made to go on white struggle sessions and learn about how terrible they are as white men. The only thing that a nuclear scientist should be an expert in is nuclear science. The only thing a physicist should be expert in is being a physicist. Every profession in which this is pushed through is a profession which is going to suffer a loss of energy and a loss of time that could be spent better on doing the thing it's meant to be doing. And all of the time spent on that is time that our rivals and competitors are spending on the main thing. So I think there's an enormous waste of time, waste of energy, and waste of effort. I think that that is going to have, already is having, significant consequences on the competitiveness of Western societies and Western economies. And the other thing is, you will always suffer. And let me put it this way. One of the benefits that free societies have over unfree societies is historically the ability to think through problems freely. So if you lived in the Soviet Union, there were many problems you couldn't answer because you knew what the answers couldn't be, because you knew that the solution to everything had to be Soviet Marxist Leninism. Therefore, if the answer had been to anything, let alone to everything, a free market, you couldn't come to that conclusion. You had to say that we needed to do the planned economy better, because the structure of what was agreed to work had already been agreed upon, and therefore nothing outside of it could occur. Now, one of the advantages of a free society is that you don't do that. You don't say, we know what the parameters of thought are, and you're not allowed to veer outside them. One of our tactical, technological advantages has been that we don't do that we weigh up the evidence, that the scientific method works, that free inquiry works not just because it's nice, but because it's the best way of coming up with answers to questions. And my worry is that we have ended up in field after field unable to answer questions because we've cut off what the answers cannot be. For instance, and this one is not on race, but for instance, in coding, famously in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, most people interested in coding are young men. There's all sorts of biological reasons for that we don't need to go into. If you say, no, we need to have 50% of coders are men and 50% are women, and if the black population is 13% in America, at least 13% have to be black, you simply aren't going to get the best coders, because you've decided that the priority is not the best, the priority is diversity. And it means that you will simply not perform as well as a company as you might have done. And you can play that exercise across every field of endeavor, in schools, in hospitals, in medicine, in scientific inquiry. And you mentioned the issue of the scientific method. One of the things that is most alarming about the war on the West is the fact that even the scientific method is now under attack because it is perceived as Western. Even mathematical accuracy, as I detail in the book, is being attacked because it is alleged to be a white thing, which, of course, first of all, is madness. Mathematical methods came up through a bewildering array of societies and cultures and happen to have been refined in the West. But if you decide that these things are the problem because they have been practiced in the West, you rob ourselves of the best tools we have, tools that work not because they have been practiced by white men or practiced in the West, but because they work. And there is no evidence that for instance, contrary mathematical methods, which are being madly presented by particularly radical black activists in America, there is no evidence that these contrary means work at all. They have not yet solved one mathematical problem. They have not produced one theorem. And you can do that in field after field. We are tearing down methods that work and are at risk of trying to replace them with methods that at the very least haven't even solved one problem to date.
Well, that concludes our interview. I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Murray, for being with us. Your book is a success here. I will keep recommending it to my viewers. It's a great book. Thank you very much for taking the time, and I wish you all the success to you and your book.
Thank you very much, and to you and to all of your viewers and readers. Thank you.
Thank you.